Now, I am trying to cover two important topics here. First, what is the best practice for VM or VM access? Now, before we talked about VM, I'll cover basics of network first. In Azure, if you want to build a network or VM first, you need to build a component called Azure Networks. Azure Network is your VNet. So it's a VNet and virtual network. So virtual network is a component which we use to assign IP address automatically to the virtual machines. So as a best practice, we need to create a VNet with a private range 10.0.0.0 10 series or 192.168 series for class C or 172.16 range class B. Any private range we need to use. And the best practice when you define this VNet range, we called as address space. And inside that, logically, you need to define some subnets. So now we have a VNet range, say 1016 overall range, and logically small subnets. Subnet number one, say my web subnet or my Gembox subnet, and this subnet is my web subnet. So this range will be 10.0.0.0/24, and next subnet will be 10.0.1.0. So you see, as per the range 0010, if you build your first VM here, the first valid IP for VM is 04 as per the subnet. Next subnet is 10.0.1.4. So, and by default, these subnet is a part of the VNet. So if you need tomorrow another subnet, you should have another subnet or another application comes up, suppose SAP application. In that case, you'd add some new subnet there, subnet number 3. So you have multiple freedom to add n number of subnets, but all these subnets should be based on the entire range. An entire range should be your address space. So anything beyond that range, you cannot deploy any subnet. So it has to be within that range. Now next is now once you deploy a VM got two IPs practically. One is a red IP and one is a green IP. Two IPs Microsoft will release for a VM. Red IP is your public IP, and green IP is your private IP. So public IP will have an attack or DOS attack Anybody can send millions of packets and crash my machine. So it's highly recommended that you should not have a public IP on a VM. Let's do this first quickly. Portal.azure.com. I'm into the resource group, creating a folder resource group in West US region. So it's a seminar, webinar. I'll put it the name West US. I'll deploy my network, VNet. West US. IP range 10.0.0.16 and default subnet. Delete. I don't want default subnet. Add a subnet. So I'm deploying my first subnet, jump box. I will tell you what do you mean by jump box. So the jump box is 10.0.0.24. And next subnet is my web subnet, 10.0.1.0. So two subnets. Now I'm deploying my one normal VM. As I said 5 minutes before, normal VM means you should have a public IP and private IP together. So as a best practice, we should not have a public IP for the security perspective. So I'm going to create one simple VM first, and then I'll show you the private IP and public IP both for a VM. So I'm deploying my first VM into subnet 1, which is my jump box subnet. It's Windows 11, V2MS, RDP allowed as a firewall, and I'll make sure it's in my jump box subnet and public IP is also allowed. I'm not doing anything, in reality. And I'm creating my first VM in the jump box with public IP as default. So now, as we discussed 5 minutes before, public IP red one is not recommended. People can do attack on this public IP and it accessible over internet. So that's not good. So then how we connect the Azure VM securely? So if I go to OneDrive, InfoSec, diagrams. So there is a one slide I created, diagram as a scenario. So how to connect Azure VM securely? If we are in a hybrid network, on premises and Azure, we can do the VPN services on-prem to Azure VPN and then access with a private IP or express route. We will discuss this in later on. Right now, let's discuss cloud-only solution. So cloud-only, we have two solutions, Jumpbox and Bastion Host. What is Jumpbox? 5 minutes before I said VM should not have a public IP. It's correct. So we should not have a production VM having a public IP. Non-production, still it's okay, you know. So what I have done, VM with a green IP, only private IP, VM with a red IP is public IP. So I make one dedicated subnet with a red IP, and production VM should not have a red IP. So admin cannot connect to the production machines because they don't have a red IP. So admin connect to the jump box, and from there it connect the private IP. So it's RDP into RDP. Anybody do a crash attack on this machine, I'm not worried because these are not my prod VMs. So it means dedicated subnet, red VMs, and all production machines, only green VMs. So if we do this kind of arrangement, we call it as jump box. So I'm creating my second VM as a prod VM, and it should be in a subnet number 2. And in a prod VM, I'll make sure RDP public IP not allowed, simple username and password. And under networking, I'll make sure this is in my production machine, not in Jumpbox, and no public IP. Public IP also none. So public IP none, public IP RDP also none. So nobody can connect over internet through this IP. So once it is done, I'm going to show you my Jumpbox VM is having 10.0.0.0 IP plus one public IP, 77, whatever, something. So two IPs. And prod VM having no public IP and only the private IP. So it means anybody comes in with this public IP, log in RDP, and then RDP into RDP privately. Directly, we cannot log into the prod VM. Let's deploy this VM. We'll come back here. The next is there's another method called Bastion host. So what is Bastion host? So Bastion host, you need to deploy a dedicated subnet and that dedicated subnet is A caps, B caps, S caps, and you need to deploy a service called Azure Bastion service having a public IP. The service have a public IP. So admin login into the portal, kickstart the TLS, and through this service, when they start the session 443, it redirected to 338922. And these VM have no public IP. So without using VM public IP, through this service, it redirects to 338922. And the web session of the VM is established. https://bastion-host BST URL, and the web session will be initiated. So without exposing public IP, we are in a position to connect the Azure VM with securely. That's the second option. I'll show you. So now I'm going to click on the VNet, go to the subnets, and add a subnet, a dedicated subnet called Azure Bastion, 𝐴𝐶𝐵𝐶𝐶, 𝐴𝐶𝐶, /26 is enough, and add a separate subnet for the Bastion host. And then deploy a service, Bastion, Kumar Bastion, West US, standard or premium, integrate with which network. Automatically he picked up the subnet and then public IP. So Microsoft released a public IP for the service, integrate with the subnet, and deploy.